Namaste and welcome to Sustainable Narratives, Vichar Manthan's online conference looking at sustainable ideas. We've had so far a fantastic 3 days of discussions, panel discussions and fireside conversations. And today we are in our final day. And what better time than to introduce to you Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Most of you probably don't need for me to introduce him because you probably know who he is, but I should tell you that nevertheless he has a PhD, he's an author, he's a politician, and he's a former senior diplomat with the United Nations. He comes with over 3 decades of experience with the United Nations, where he worked as a peacekeeper, he worked with international refugees, and he worked as the Undersecretary General when Kofi Annan was in charge of the United Nations. He's also an author of over 20 books. One of my favorites was The Inglorious Empire, which I'm sure many of you have consumed and read and reread. So Shashi, it's a real pleasure. Thank you for joining us on Sustainable Narratives.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful. So look, I mean, I want to get kind of straight into it. We only have 45 minutes in these fireside conversations, and you know, there's often quite a lot to cover. But you know, and the first thing I want to talk to you about a little bit is, look, it seems to us that the world is going through, in some significant sense, great changes, right? Economic power is shifting from West, the liberal democracy of the West, towards the East. And you know, you've always had this notion that the Chinese model of this state-backed capitalism and in some sense, a very much and an increasing, so it looks like, totalitarian sort of state versus the liberal democracies. And somewhere in there is the Indian story, which I'd like to pick up on. And you know, on the one side, the world has never had it so good. We're more integrated. You know, the world has, on the whole, health-wise, ecologically, all the rest of it, you know, we've never had it so good on one side. On the other side, we can see bouts of tribalism, identity politics, and a totalitarian state, which is, you know, on the rise, and the liberal democracies seem to be struggling, at least in the West. What's your take on some of this? Just some broad brushes.
Well, that's a pretty vast topic, Sachin. I think that, yes, there has been certainly a rise, generally speaking, of nationalist strongmen in the world, something which the COVID crisis has actually reinforced. And in the specific example you raise of the China versus India argument, that the Chinese model has somehow been more successful than the Indian model, this is something which has led many to debate whether, in fact, the bread versus freedom argument has been won by China. That's the old argument that, you know, what's more important? The Chinese say we deliver bread and freedom is dispensable. And India has this sort of, you know, the creative chaos of all singing, all dancing Bollywood versus the sort of perfectly choreographed precision of the Beijing Olympic Games opening ceremony as sort of the two contrasts of the military discipline of the Chinese delivering results and the democratic freedoms of India, which doesn't. And let me say right away, the systems are dramatically different. If China wants to build a new 6-lane expressway, it can bulldoze its way past any number of villages in its path. Whereas in India, if you want to widen a 2-lane road, you could be tied up in court for a dozen years with political parties demonstrating against you and movie stars coming on hunger strike and flags and banners and everything else, environmental groups, human rights activists, everyone will fight you. And that is India. And the answer to the dilemma this seems to pose is not to just surrender to the idea that autocracy is more efficient, because the main issue is that India has mechanisms to deal with dissent, whereas China's suppression of democratic politics, which has been made worse by Xi Jinping's acquisition of sort of lifetime power here, could prove unsustainable in the long run when a more educated Chinese populace begins to assert its rights. And there's a whole literature around this now. Since you're young people who like to read, you began by referring to one of my books. There's a book by a man called Daniel Bell, who's an American professor at Beijing Tsinghua University, called the China model, which argues that the authoritarianism of China is a better model of governance than India's and the West's democracy. And he says basically that it is meritocratic. It's political meritocracy, he says. And when you have the counter argument, for example, Amartya Sen famously argued that famines don't occur in democracies with a free press because their governments would be unable to ignore the suffering, whereas in autocratic systems, tragedies like that occur. Bell argues that China has also avoided famine and done better than democratic India on malnutrition. So his argument is you don't have to be democratic to serve your people effectively. And I think that there are Indians who get impatient with our electoral system and our democratic politics, which some say are merely busy undercutting each other rather than focusing on results for the Indian people. And there are many people around the present government in India who would, I think, dearly like to do away with the opposition. In fact, opposition criticism of the government is routinely dismissed as anti-national, in other words, as treasonous. And that's something which raises a more serious philosophical question. Is the instability of political contention a luxury that a developing country can't afford? I would argue that it is simply because democracy is actually fundamental, not just to delivering better governance, but to actually ensuring that human beings are the absolute object of government policy, which sadly speaking, they're not necessarily an autocratic system.
No, absolutely. And you know, just kind of coming out of the India-China story a little bit, taking a slightly macro picture, looking at you mentioned the liberal democracy of the West. Generally, where do you see as the kind of, if I had to tell you, say to me, what are the three most biggest challenges that actually the globe faces right now, right? And I'm thinking more specifically from a governance perspective. What would they be? What are these three big challenges that you see coming our way between now and 2050?
Well, I mean, I think the three that are evident right now are, first of all, the one we've just been talking about, the challenge of democracy. There's some interesting work done by a couple of Harvard professors, Yasha Monk and Robert Stefanofor, which have convincingly argued that support for democracy is declining even in the democracies, and that they are analyzing something called democratic deconsolidation, where more and more people are getting impatient with democracy. And that's why the argument of someone like Daniel Bell strikes such a responsive chord. So I'd say that's one big issue. How will that play out between now and 2050? Linked to that is the rise of nationalism, which brings with it various implications, including increasing deglobalization, moving away from the convergence we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years in world economics and in world politics. We're also seeing, I would argue, more insularity and protectionism, and to some degree, an abandonment of multilateralism. The UN and international institutions set up at the end of the Second World War, I think, are vulnerable as never before. We've had President Trump announcing the US's withdrawal from the WHO, the World Health Organization, an unimaginable thought when the organization was founded, and until this year, the US has been its principal donor. So where do we, instead of strengthening multilateral institutions, where we see a major multilateral challenge like COVID, we seem to be in the process of undermining them. A third major issue, and each of these, of course, can deserve longer conversations. I'm just giving you the headlines. And the third major issue is undoubtedly that of the environment, the sustainability of our planet in the face of the enormous challenges we're facing. And I think that's one thing where a group of relatively young people like you don't need to be lectured at by this oldie who's part of the generation that's created the problem. We are facing some real challenges in many ways about our ability to sustain the planet and the way in which we have been running it
Right.
for the last period.
Can I sort of dig in a little bit further into each of those three a little bit, maybe? So one is about, you said democracy, right? So in some sense, there's a deconsolidation around democracies, and you can sense that in young people, actually. But there's also something else going on in the wider culture. I mean, I'm thinking, so one of the things that the themes that have come out of this conference, for example, have been that, you know, in the liberal West, we had a Professor Steve Sung, who is the head of the China Institute here in London, in SOAS. And he made the point really strikingly that actually what you've got is democracy by its very nature seems to always create the median. It's always mediocre. And so it seems like and I think you alluded to it, that it can seem very sort of bumbling along in its own chaotic manner. Whereas a totalitarian state like China looks on the surface very crisp, very clear. And yes, he conceded that, you know, the last 10, 15 years, the liberal democracies have not done so well. And their populace hasn't really economically got any better off. They've had no real pay rise in 10 years. The level of leadership, the level of the big questions, there's been no real inspiration within the liberal democracies. And in 2008, I think, took away a lot of confidence within the system and the institutions with the financial crash and the way in which we failed to kind of really upgrade the system or upgrade the software, as one of the economists that we had, Eric Lonegum, said. All this is going on. Is there something fundamentally gone wrong with our liberal democracy that's causing all of this? Or is this just a natural ebb and flow of a democracy? You know.
It's too soon to answer that question simply because we don't know how this is going to play out. We are looking at a time in which there's an unprecedented number of strongmen who are not particularly fond of democracies having risen to head democracies. So elections brought a Trump to power, an Erdogan to power, a Modi to power, have brought people close to power like Le Pen in France, AfD in Germany, the Austrian who narrowly lost the presidential election from essentially a neo-fascist movement.
But is that because there's something fundamentally wrong at that grassroots?
No, I mean, wrong. The argument always is that democracy, number one, has not delivered the results people were expecting, particularly in terms of their personal economic welfare. And the second argument has been that it's also tended to open up too much to people whom the existing populations are not terribly happy to share their well-being with. Refugees, immigrants, foreigners, people of different colors of skin, different religions, different languages. What's Brexit all about in many ways is fundamentally a visceral rejection of just hearing foreign languages spoken on the London bus system. I mean, you've really got a certain amount of xenophobia that's part of, I always see two backlashes against globalization. There's the economic backlash we all know about, the blue-collar workers who saw their jobs being exported to Shanghai, that sort of thing, and who said, why have our democratic systems actually not worked for us, but worked to benefit the fat cats and Goldman Sachs in the boardrooms by taking our jobs away and bringing money to them? So there's been that kind of resentment which populists have locked into. But there's also been a cultural backlash. And this entire phenomenon of leaders saying, listen, we are more authentic representatives of you, the people. We speak for the people. That has had a strange sort of appeal. And you've seen, for example, that during the era of globalization, we had the birth of Davos man. We had the whole idea of the global citizen. And now we have an era in which Theresa May can say, if you consider yourself a citizen of the world, you haven't the slightest idea what citizenship is all about. David Goodhart's theory that there's a battle between the somewheres and the anywheres, the people who are at home anywhere in the world, who can actually, shall we say, see themselves in business class lounges across the planet, conferring in five-star hotels, as comfortable in a meeting room in New York as they would be on a beach in Java. And these people are out of touch with the tangible realities of the somewheres, the people who are rooted in one place, in one religion and one way of life, speak one language, have one set of prejudices which they share with their neighbors, and who are uncomfortable with the anywheres. Now, this world, I'm not totally convinced by Goodhart's thesis, don't get me wrong. I should tell you I've written an entire book, which will be out at the end of this year, on this entire question of nationalism, globally as well as in India. But I do feel that this is a very important development that we can't afford to neglect. It's tied up with the rejection of globalization. It's tied up with the rejection of neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus and all of these things that were somewhat smugly propounded as the ultimate answer to everything, just as Francis Fukuyama talked about liberal democracy and capitalism as the end of history. The big questions of history, he said in 1992, have been settled. Well, we're now 30 years later and they haven't been settled. In fact, if anything, they seem to be in retreat while this other approach is gaining ground and gaining votes. So that's why
significant failure of the elites, right? That would be a failure of the elites. Would you say that?
Yeah, and a rejection of the elites by the bulk of voters in democracies, which is again in itself a bit worrying, because appealing to populist sentiment is what first brought fascists to power in Italy and Germany and so on. It's very easy to stoke up hatreds and divisions, to denounce the liberals, the gays, the blacks, the Muslims, whatever, and say, we are authentic, vote for us because we're like you, we enshrine the prejudices that you have. I mean, that's an awful basis on which to win power, but it has been winning power in an alarming number of democracies. And in many cases, these people have lasted quite a while. Erdogan is around now 16 years. Orban seems to have absolutely no challengers in Hungary.
You've got Putin as well, who kind of appeals.
Putin has a very similar appeal. Xi Jinping has actually got a very similar nationalist appeal. And Mr. Modi is now comfortably into his second term. And so you're looking at a situation where these people can turn around and say to the likes of you and me, well, we are what the people want. And so this is certainly a very important challenge. Will they win in the long term? Because you gave this wonderful target date of 2050, Sachin. Will we look back on the world in 2050 and say, well, these guys won and that's the kind of world we're living in now? Or are we going to say this is a brief spasm in global history, after which the liberals, the open-minded, civic nationalists, constitutionalists, multilateralists, internationalists brought back a reformed, humane version of globalization that actually brought everyone along? I don't know. And I will say that, it's always tempting to draw facile analogies to history. I know there are some people who see the 2020s as ominous harbingers of the kind of world that the 1930s gave the world. I don't want to draw those conclusions at all. I'm explicitly not saying that. But what I am saying is there are important trends that are visible to us now, and those of us who are in a position to challenge or resist those trends and not just describe them, I think have a duty to start doing so.
Wow. And that to me, having someone like you tell us that actually, the future is uncertain, right? And it is a battle of ideas out there. And more people need to engage with this sort of discussion and really rethink or recalibrate what's going on in the world. I want to talk a little bit about the second challenge you mentioned, right? Which is this, and it kind of overlaps, obviously, is this growing nationalism. The world has never been so integrated, right? You and I are talking from 5,000 miles away, we're having this conversation perfectly well. The world is more integrated than ever. Therefore, there is more human interaction, more human ideas, more intermixing going on, through all the different races and ethnicities. And yet, as you said, there is this appeal to the soil, this appeal to ethnic nationalism, right? For example, the US has always had a sense of patriotism, right? You're American first, and then under the American sort of umbrella, you have lots and lots of other sub-identities, no problem, but you're American first. So there's a sense of patriotism that the US has always had, and I've always seen that as kind of cultural nationalism. Now you're getting this ethnic nationalism, right? And you're about to write a book, so maybe you can kind of share some hot off the press sort of stuff, the things that you can share with that. What's going on? Why this ethnic?
I would slightly redefine the terms you've used. Patriotism is basically about loving your own country because it's yours. It's like loving your mom because she's yours. She may not be the best-looking, smartest person on the planet, but she's your mom and you love her. That sort of thing is what patriotism is all about. It's my country. I love it. I see its flaws, but I still love it. And what's more, I fully accept that you may have a different country you love because you were born somewhere else, and good for you. I mean, we all accept each other's patriotisms. Patriotism is fundamentally a benign, non-threatening emotion, and it is essentially an emotion. Whereas nationalism...
It binds people together, right? But it binds...
Yes, it does. It does, and it's not exclusively cultural. It certainly could have those elements, but the fact is that I find that patriotism is often best expressed and evoked in what I call civic nationalism, which is the kind of nationalism anchored in a constitution that grants everyone equal rights, so that you don't have to belong to a specific culture, a specific religion, speak a specific language or whatever. You just have to feel a sense of belonging to that country to partake in that patriotism. And so a country like India, where we have multiple religions, multiple cultures, multiple languages, multiple cuisines, multiple ethnicities, multiple everythings, really. That, to my mind, is the only viable sort of patriotism for a country like India. I've often used a metaphor I came up with about 20 years ago, never stopped using, the metaphor of the thali. I came up with it in reaction to the American idea of the melting pot, where everyone comes in from all over the world, gets stirred into this cauldron, becomes American. I said, India, we don't have a melting pot, we have a thali. The people sitting in different bowls, and because they're in different bowls, they don't necessarily flow into the next, but they belong together on the same platter, and they combine on your palate to give you a satisfying repast. That is the Indian nationalism. So it has to be large enough and inclusive enough to accommodate multiple identities. So you can be a good Muslim, a good Bengali, a good Indian all at once. But it's possible.
Good in that scenario is defined by the constitution.
The word so yeah, exactly. Your patriotism is linked to loyalty to the Constitution and to the idea of the nation that the Constitution embodies, which is why I call it civic nationalism. And it's supported by institutions.
What happens, Shashi, when, take for example, right, your Italian analogy, and it's great, so long as all of those pots want to stay in one thali, right? Like, what happens though when you have certain ideologies that are international in nature, they're universal in nature, but they're threatening to all nations, right? And you know what I'm referring to. So how do you deal with these sorts of ideologies with that kind of?
Through liberal constitutionalism. In other words, if every identity is able to feel secure because it has rights equivalent to others, it is less vulnerable to surrendering to the kind of appeal you talk about. Let's take some very, very specific examples from history. The nationalism we saw in the world between the two world wars was very much strongly ethno-nationalist. So the Germans, for example, under the Nazis, propounded a theory of Aryan racial superiority, persecuted and eventually killed the Jews, came up with an approach that essentially excluded non-Germans from the purview of their patriotism, and at the same time demanded the right to put all Germans under their umbrella. So Germans in Czechoslovakia, in the Sudetenland, were conquered because they were German, therefore they belonged to the German nation. Austria was merged into Germany because there were German speakers, and so on. So you had a nationalism that was cultural, to use your word, ethnic, certainly caught up with religion because they all had to be good Christians, with race because they had to be white and Aryan, and so on. So you had these totalizing absolutes that defined what nationalism was. Whereas the contrasting nationalism that India offers today, that in its own way America offers, that many liberal democracies are increasingly turning themselves into, is one which says you can be part of our nation and a patriot in our nation, even though you are not all of these things. So you can be not ethnically German, not even white. Maybe German is not your mother tongue and you're speaking Turkish at home. You're going to a mosque rather than to a church. But you were born here, you were raised here, you believe in our constitution, our basic law, our systems, and you are a 21st century German citizen and a German patriot. And there are people like that, by the way, who are playing football in the German football team. Yeah. And that's essentially a new kind of nationalism. Now, these two nationalisms are fundamentally incompatible.
Right. And you believe that theory, that sort of idea of the kind of the positive nationalism that you just mentioned, even in Germany, right, you are seeing a massive rise of the far right. And it worries the hell out of people like me in Europe because it's sweeping across Europe, by the way.
Exactly. And so that's precisely the phenomenon I was talking about.
Is that just a theoretical model?
Well, in Germany, you're referring to groups like Alternative for Deutschland, yes. Which, as you know, came second best in the elections. Whereas in India, you're talking about the Hindutva movement, which actually won the election and indeed has won 2 elections and is busy trying to redefine Indian nationalism in ways fundamentally different from the nationalism enshrined in the constitution that I've described to you. So here you've got a very interesting sort of debate going on. As long as it's taking place within a democracy and a democracy operating under the rule of law and within a constitutional framework, there is hope both that it can be resolved peacefully, but also that a resolution coming out of one election need not necessarily be permanent because the next election gives people a chance to reverse it. And that's where, in many ways, our 2 points, the earlier one we discussed about democracy and this one about nationalism, actually tie in together, because ultimately democracy's greatest strength, other than the fact that it actually permits diversity, is that it is a self-correcting mechanism. The democracy is not just an event like an election, it's a process, an ongoing and ideally permanent process of deliberation, discussion, debate, voting, and outcomes, which then every few years, 4 years, 5 years, get renewed by the electorate. Okay. So that arguably no mistake is irreversible.
Okay.
But we haven't talked about the other implication of nationalism, which is the undermining of multilateralism.
Yes.
That I do worry about, because I think that in a country like India, we really feel that the global system actually works for the benefit of all of us, and particularly of the developing world. And if the big countries that were actually the prime movers of setting up a multilateral system at the end of the Second World War, if they start backing away from it as Donald Trump's US is doing, then I think the world could well be in trouble.
Yeah, and that kind of doesn't. So okay, that's great, because you've just segued into another question that I have for you is, does it look like that the I would say that the power or the hegemony of the West, or US in particular, has for once and for all gone? Or is US having some sort of blip and actually the West will re-ascertain the control of the international order again? So there's 2 things there. One is the US is the US now going to concede some of this to the other powers that are rising? And if so, what does that new tripolar world look like between the US, China, and India? What does that look like?
Well, first of all, I mean, the US is not yet an eclipse in my view. It still is the world's leading superpower. Its military budget is equivalent to that of the rest of the world put together. Its economy, with its extraordinary capacity for innovation and entrepreneurship and growth, is still the engine of the world. But economically, it seems on the verge of being overtaken by China. Whether it's going to happen in the next 2 years or the next 5 years or the next 10 years, there are theory backers for each of these theories. in purchasing power terms, China is already pretty much there. And I think you're looking at China heading irresistibly onwards, unless there's going to be some dramatic and unforeseeable reversals in China's course. Militarily, however, I think the US is still more powerful. And the attractiveness of the American model, to my mind, is still greater globally than that of the Chinese model. And that remains a significant factor. But the unipolar era is pretty much over. The days in which, let's say, roughly from 1990 to about 2010, the US was literally the only game in town globally in global geopolitics. There was no player who could hold a candle to the US. That is over because China's rise is now so visible and so stark and so dramatic. China has already, for example, supplanted the US as the #1 manufacturing economy in the world. It is the biggest exporter in the world. And it is, I think, going to be, in terms of overall GDP, it's going to overtake the US inevitably at some point between 2 years and 10 years. So, about population means that per capita, the US will actually be ahead of China for a long time. But per capita is not the only measure that matters. In absolute economic strength, I think China is going to be obviously a very significant player.
Sachin, quickly on that, before just to kind of caveat in here. But the China offers a very different worldview to the US, right? As we've discussed already, very, very different. In that, Tony Blair used to always say, when he used to talk about why Britain needs to stay in Europe, he used to always say one thing, that by 2050, you're gonna live in a tripolar world. No, he said you'd probably live in a tripolar world, but definitely in a bipolar world. And the probably would always be India. India, probably. It'll always be bracketed. India, probably. I just want to ask you, can we now delete the probability? Is India on, has the Indian story matured enough that actually there's probably little doubt that India will be the tripolar?
I wish I could say yes. I mean, there was a time, I think, that I would have wanted to say that. I think I don't want to encourage the complacency of some who are saying that today, because I believe India has to get its act together internally before it can aspire to be the third leg of that tripod. And the reason is multiple. It's certainly to do with the overt spreading of bigotry from the top in our domestic politics, which has created a level of insecurity on the part of our largest minority, the Muslim community, that is truly capable of undermining Indian unity and Indian success. That's one problem. The second one is a take no prisoners kind of politics, which, as I said earlier, discredits and delegitimizes dissent and treats all disagreement as anti-national. That is again going to undermine the weakness, the strengths of India. And the third internal political problem is the discrediting of diversity. I have long argued, and some of you are familiar with my earlier books, there are 20 of them, take your pick, that diversity is an asset and a strength for India and not an indication of weakness. And that the unity of our diversity is what makes us special as well as strong in the world and makes us an admirable example to the world of the successful management of diversity. Right. That, sadly, is not acceptable to the present lot. And finally, in economics...
India is still probably.
Well, economics is the final thing, because there hasn't been in the last few years the kind of takeoff that people optimistically predicted when Mr. Modi's government came to power, that there would be this dramatic increase in India's GDP growth, as well as its willingness to cast off the shackles of old practices. In fact, we have seen no significant economic reforms, as Western economic analysts keep complaining. The ease of doing business that Mr. Modi talked about, reforms to labor legislation, land laws, and other procedural issues which have held back investment. And finally, the regulatory climate is just as bureaucratic. Some argue it's even worse than it used to be, which means that the willingness of people to come in and make India into the next China has not been there. So that even companies leaving China have preferred to go to countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, rather than to India. And that means that the economic component of this aspiration has not been fulfilled. I think we would need a really a different kind of India to be what you hoped it would be,
Right.
namely an India that is both economically adventurous, open and liberal, as well as at the same time politically unifying, inclusive and enshrining of India's unique
This is fascinating.
characteristics.
Because as you know, in one of the other panels earlier in the conference, we had Ram Madhav come and speak, and he gave a very different story about all of this, of the tripolar world, which you can expect why. But I want to go to then, okay, if we just for a minute remove the India story out, and then you've got China, you've got the US, right? China seems to be practicing a type of economics and a type of political order that, you know, it's kind of almost like, it reminds me a little bit of the old East India Company that you so well have written about, where you kind of go in as traders, you build some ports, and the countries can't afford to return the debt, you take over the port. Is this model going to wash with the world, or do you think actually this is bad news for China if that's the kind of economics or politics it wants to play? What's your take on that? Because the US is stumbling, we accept that right now, but is China, you know, sort of, I don't know, what do you think to this?
Well, no, I think you know, if I were a Chinese, I'd be a dissident myself, because I think the Chinese are also shooting themselves in the foot with their current policy of aggressively trying to deal with both internal dissent and external disputes. They have, for example, been incredibly aggressive almost simultaneously with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with India, and with Japan, all at the same time. And I think they're really, I think they're making a fairly severe mistake. Xi Jinping at the moment has been so busy consolidating his power and his authority, eliminating all possible rivals, monopolizing the positions of power that leaders like Deng Xiaoping and others had before, and also removing the two-term restriction on Chinese heads of state and government that was enshrined with Zhang Zemin in the 90s. So we've had 3 or 4 who did 10 years and made way in a very predictable fashion for the next leader. And suddenly Xi Jinping was a beneficiary of that system, scrapped the system. So he's essentially president for life, which means that he also then becomes the focus of blame when things go wrong. Now, right now, he is busy making so many enemies for China on its borders. I'm just wondering how long that's sustainable. At a time when, as you know, there's a lot of anger with China over COVID, many countries blame China for having originated the virus, for having concealed it for a long time, for having essentially misled the world about it, and for thereby having caused the enormous amount of death and economic loss and suffering. And then on top of that, China was the first to recover and is now trying to do everything from checkbook diplomacy to exercising, flexing its muscles, to spending its money, claiming to be the global savior. Well, a lot of people don't like that. The Japanese have announced a fund of $2.25 billion for Japanese companies who are willing to pull out of China and come back home. And you've got Australia questioning their trade agreement with China. You've got India certainly extremely disturbed by the misbehavior of China on the border, the sort of salami slicing tactics of taking up territory and land and so on. And finally, you're also seeing, I think, an exasperation level in the boardrooms of the West, which, of course, Mr. Trump has been articulating most overtly, but which others, I think, who don't share Mr. Trump's eccentricities are also expressing. And I think all of this is going to hurt China. It's still playing itself out. So I don't know how it's going, but I would say that I think that the Chinese are not actually doing themselves any favors by their current attitudes to the rest of the world.
It almost feels, I'm just conscious of time, I'm afraid. We've consumed 45 minutes like very, very quickly, right? Sashi, I want you to kind of make a few closing remarks around 2 points. We've not even mentioned the United Nations, if you've noticed, right? which is scary in itself, right? That we haven't mentioned the United Nations in this. So one is, in your closing remarks, tell me, what role, if any, does the United Nations need to play in order to kind of maintain this multinational, integrated world, right? Where the rule-based trade and policies, diplomacy can take place. That's one. And number two is liberal democracies. What would be your message to liberal democracies directly in order to kind of maintain a world where we've got liberty and plurality and diversity, to maintain that and do not sleepwalk into a totalitarian future like the one China possibly offers? So just two closing remarks on that.
Well, I think that, we have definitely been seeing a rise in an assertion of national sovereignty in the course of the last few years, which is reaching a peak during the coronavirus as well, when people have had to rely on their own governments to protect them, and as a result have looked at the world with a fair amount of suspicion. The United Nations is therefore in peril. It's coming to its 75th anniversary this year. I believe it's done well enough in these 75 years to be worth preserving, but also worth reforming, because many of our global institutions, with the UN at the cornerstone of the arch, as it were, many of our global institutions and the UN agencies suffer from politicization, from manipulation by the more powerful states, from lack of independent leadership, effective representation, the Security Council, for example, lack of true autonomy. All of these things mean that there is a real worry about how do we make the UN fit for purpose in the next quarter century, so that it's not seen as an irrelevant organization as it heads towards its centenary. And I think very clearly the UN has to be the indispensable forum for creating the rules under which human beings can cooperate. I think nothing would be more calamitous than this sort of Trump withdrawal from WHO writ large across the rest of the system. We need rules and cooperation on areas of trade, of human connectivity, of innovation, of peace and security, of human rights and refugee movements, of cyberspace and outer space, and above all now, as COVID has proven to us, of dealing with pandemic disease. We need international cooperation. And so we must actually recognize the shared interests of our common humanity, and the United Nations is an existing forum. It may not be perfect, but we've got it. It'll be crazy to destroy it or undermine it, because it may be difficult to rebuild again if we do that. So I think it's very important that the UN rise to the occasion now, and at the same time that the countries of the world realize that we can't afford to do without it. That, I think, is the fundamental answer on your question about the UN. I've already forgotten your second question.
What would be your final message, 2 minutes, on liberal democracies and, what ought liberal democracies do in order to respond to this totalitarian future, which, seems very uncertain, and it seems to be coming closer. So tell us about that.
No, I don't want to be pessimistic about a totalitarian future.
Well, you've scared
we have elements.
When Sachin Tharoor is not sure about that future, it worries us, right?
That's right. A chronic optimist like me, well, an optimist regards the future with uncertainty. A pessimist says things are bound to go wrong. There's going to be a totalitarian future. I'm not a pessimist. But I do believe that the future has to be fought for. You don't just sit back and let it all happen. And I think the danger is that the attractions of ethno-nationalism, of the kind of cheap populism we've seen in many democracies, of the impatience with the economic results that some democracies have delivered or failed to deliver to their people, the discrediting of globalization, all of this has made authoritarian solutions more attractive. And liberal democracies need to fight back, which means we need to fight back through the tools both of reason and of emotion. Reason, because obviously we need to make the convincing argument to people that institutions and processes that recognize their rights and protect those rights are in their interest, which is a commonsensical thing. The dictator you support today may lock you up tomorrow, or your loved ones tomorrow. And therefore, you ought to think about the value of institutions that preserve you and give you the right to agree with them or disagree with them, which is what liberal democracies do. But the second thing is the emotional appeal. And I think this is where populists and hyper-nationalists have succeeded, they don't actually win on rationality. They win on your gut. They tell you, I mean, do you really want to see these funny people with veils on their heads looking like letterboxes, to quote Boris Johnson? Do you want mosques and minarets springing up in our fair land, to quote Swiss nativists who had a referendum on mosques in their country? This kind of emotional gut nastiness can only be counteracted by emotional appeals to what we share as human beings. Stories of cooperation across religious and ethnic lines, anecdotes, incidents. We need to get those, and we need to populate social media and the public discourse with all of this. Diversity is a good thing. We need to celebrate it and show people that it can appeal to their hearts as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shashi Tharoor, for joining us at Sustainable Narratives at Vichaar Manthan's first inaugural conference. Time has flown by. Before I sign off, one more time, thank you for Shashi Tharoor. I want to tell you about what's coming up next. We have an upcoming panel discussion at 3 p.m. today, which is looking at culture and literature in a post-modern world. We have three wonderful panelists who will be joining me: Professor Lou Marinoff, Professor Makram Paranjape, and the author Amrish Tripathi. We then have a second panel discussion at 6 o'clock tonight, UK time, on Can Rights Be Sustainable Without a Set of Duties? And here we're looking at civics. And again, we have three wonderful speakers. We have Professor Lou Marinoff carrying on. We have Dr. Aniruddha Rajput, and we have Professor Matthew McManus from Washington, all joining Manoj Ladwa as he hosts that panel. And finally, at 8 o'clock, we'll be closing off the conference. So do make sure you join us for those last few minutes. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much. Namaste.